Whether you're from left, right, center, a lot of people just don't trust what's going on right now, and for good reason. And so talking about changing the system was very attractive.
Stephen, welcome to 12 Geniuses.
Thanks for having me, Don. Excited to be here.
Let's start out with your background and how you got interested in politics.
I grew up in the suburban part of Milwaukee. My parents are immigrants from India. A lot of people have seen Wisconsin in the headlines as a state that's a purple state politically, but I don't know if that even fully represents us. We're really a collection of red and blue that's not talking to each other. And I became very interested in how we can create healthier discourse, both in our state and in our country. And my first big expression of that was through the Millennial Action Project, which is a national group I founded in 2013 and has grown to be the nation's largest organization of young elected leaders, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, who are coming together across party lines around, to focus on generational issues. We, for example, passed the first major gun violence prevention bill through Congress with bipartisan support. After the Parkland shooting, we've passed many bipartisan criminal justice reforms, climate bills, among others. And our network is organized across these bipartisan, what we call future caucuses, which are groups of these young legislators at the congressional and state level. And after that, I ran for the U.S. Senate in Wisconsin, and now I'm focused on culture change and storytelling through a new organization called Bridge Entertainment Labs. So that's how I got into this.
You mentioned the Millennial Action Project. You founded it, I think, back in 2012. So it's been around a while.
Yeah.
Why did you found it?
I saw two trends that would most shape the future of our politics. One is the worsening polarization, which my initial founding team and we felt like this toxic polarization would reach a breaking point somewhere in the middle of the decade. So, depending on what you point to, whether it's 2016 or some of the things that happened after that, definitely we've reached a breaking point. The second trend is the rise of the millennial generation and Gen Z following us that would enter public office. And so the core question was, how is this next generation going to govern our country? Are we going to fall into the same polarizing habits of the status quo, which is incentivized to promote partisan conflict over constructive solutions, and sort of propagate this divisive culture in our politics? Or are we going to buck those trends? Are we going to transcend the divide? Are we going to create new incentives and new governing paradigms that makes collaborative governance more of the norm? So that was the big question we wanted to take on. And that's what led to establishing the first ever bipartisan caucus of young members of Congress, which is the Congressional Future Caucus. And then we expanded that model into now over 35 state legislatures.
What's the process of bridging this divide among these members?
Yes, well, there are three pieces to that solution, I think. So one is it's tough to collaborate with anyone across a line of difference if you don't have a trusting bond. And so building relationships is a key model of success. The second is finding ideas that don't necessarily fit neatly into the left-right paradigm, but are more reframed as future versus the past. And keep in mind, when we as Americans learn about issues, whether it's climate change or criminal justice reform, there's a specific interest in the media and major party leaders to frame these in partisan ways that make the other side always seem like the enemy or that they're evil. Two-thirds of Americans today see the other side as being fundamentally evil, not just different. And so when you can identify these issues that cut across that grain, then that creates new opportunities. The third thing that's important here is to bring this conversation into the light, into the public. I can tell you that being behind the scenes with many elected officials, as well as some of the most prominent media personalities that you would see on CNN, they have extremely constructive, respectful conversations behind closed doors, behind the scenes when the camera is not on. And then they go on cable news or they go on any kind of media platform, and that tone changes. So, what's really going on there? There are a lot of incentives, media, political, and otherwise, which I'm happy to jump into, that is causing them to polarize as they go into the public limelight. But I think we have a responsibility to counter those narratives with stories where we do bridge a divide and get something real done. Because for the American public, they don't realize this game that's being played against us. They don't realize that a lot of the division we see on media is performative. And so, therefore, we don't realize that there is a bridge to build, that there's someone to build a bridge to.
Regarding the members of the Millennial Action Project, how do they feel about this division in our country? Is it one of the top important issues for them, or what is their feeling in general?
It's definitely one of the top issues for them. Now, this is a group that came to our organization that in some ways was already predisposed around that. But also, we have people who I just want people to know that when you come to this conversation about building a more pluralistic nation, this is not about moderates and centrists. We have people in Millennial Action Project who span the entire political divide, from some of the most progressive to the most conservative and libertarian elected officials you can imagine. And so, what's important there is that people are bringing their principles and their values to the conversation. And again, I just think that that often gets missed. So I think the concern around the political divide is definitely front and center. But I also think for a lot of people who get involved with Millennial Action Project, they see our generation as being underrepresented, the future being underrepresented in political decision making. And so they also have an interest in centering that as a mission.
You had mentioned earlier gun rights and climate change, and I'm wondering if those are the issues where it's easier for younger voters to find common ground, or what are the top issues that younger voters and younger people who have political aspirations, where are they finding common ground?
Yeah, those are definitely a couple of the issues. I think there are a bunch of others too. I think, first, how you build economic opportunity that makes sense for younger people, especially in states that are losing their young people. So, how you attract and retain young talent as a workforce development issue is definitely an area we've seen a lot of action. Gun reform is definitely a big one as well. But I also think, criminal justice reform is one that may not be explicitly seen as a next gen kind of issue. But you really see a lot of the creative solutions coming from these younger legislators to, for example, deal with the fundamental issue of how you give people a real second chance in terms of expunging criminal records so people can get jobs, so they can get loans and financing to be able to start new businesses and become entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in that space. And I also think another big one is just what some people might call government reform, but just making government work better. And part of that, democracy reform. We see, for example, a ton of cross-partisan action to end partisan gerrymandering. The state of Ohio is where we had a particular win there. Or there's a new conversation about how we can open up primaries and get rid of the partisan primary, which I know sounds like a unsexy process issue, but it's one of the sexiest ways to get and incentivize elected officials to work together on behalf of the public. So I think democracy reform is also a big issue. We found a lot of traction. And then the final one related to that is anti-corruption. Um, there is a system of legalized bribery right now in Congress, and you see this perpetual like race for self-preservation, which also calls into question the need for term limits. I think those type of issues are also big areas where younger people in particular are interested in working.
We talked about where there's common ground among younger voters and younger political aspirations. Where is there divergence?
Yeah. I think that there are a few interesting issues that come up. So one is definitely the national debt, which is an issue that divides, I think, a number of Democrats and Republicans, like how much deficit spending is healthy. And I definitely see a healthy interest among a lot of younger Republicans who want to get our fiscal house more in order. And I think that that's definitely a healthy conversation to have. I think that, young people are just not a monolith. And, I see a big divide among people who are on the sort of political career ladder versus people who are not. Because if you're on the career ladder, you might be willing to do whatever it takes to get a job or to advance your career, versus there's everyone else who's just wondering why the system is so dysfunctional right now. I think there are healthy disagreements around immigration reform too.
Immigration reform, it seems like both parties should be incented to find common ground there, because we need people coming into this country.
Right, but Don, that's actually the exact issue here. Is the members of Congress are not incented to pass immigration reform right now, and it's immigration. If you think about it, for them is a lot more profitable to keep on the ballot than to actually resolve. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it's one of those issues that allows you to gin up votes as well as dollars for your reelection. So let me put it this way: if there was a constructive immigration reform right now to enhance the legal immigration system for the exact reason you mentioned, that businesses need workers right now, and there's a huge skills gap in our country, a humane path to citizenship for people, the roughly 10 or 11 million people who are here in an undocumented fashion, as well as have smart ways to secure the border, which involves a lot of technology, among other things. That type of proposal would get a majority of Congress to support it right now if it were a secret ballot. So, in the absence of that, there's way too much incentive to actually not pass the issue and keep that on the ballot. So this is an issue where there is an existing consensus that cannot be realized because of these broken political incentives. Republicans, take Marco Rubio, for example, who was part of bipartisan immigration reform until he was told by both his party bosses as well as his own grassroots that you're going to get primaried if you jump on this issue. And similarly, in a different way, I've seen an issue on the Democratic side where there are broad-based solutions here, but some Democrats want sort of all or nothing kind of approach. So, for example, the DREAM Act, which ensures that these dreamers who are here for no fault of their own, they came to this country as little kids with their parents, who, by all intents and purposes, are Americans and are contributing to our country, including serving in our military and doing a number of great things, might not have access to in-state tuition benefits. They don't have the full status of being documented. So the DREAM Act is something that has wide bipartisan support, but will not also be put on the floor. And that's because there's some members of actually the Democratic Party who don't want to see only the DREAM Act pass without some of the other pieces as well. So again, this is an issue of incentives right now.
Is the primary incentive fundraising, or
Yeah,
are there other major ones?
I'll point to three biggest incentive problems: money, primaries, media. So, and you've already pointed to a couple of them. So the issue around money is multifaceted. Members of Congress spend often most of their time fundraising. They're not even doing their jobs right now. The second is, if you need to raise as much money as you need to get good committee assignments, which are essentially auctioned off right now to people who can pay the most. What's the easiest way to raise money? Either from corporate interests who have business in front of your committees, or from dialing up the divisiveness and getting small donors to contribute to the campaign. So a couple of issues around the money. Primaries, in a lot of states you have closed or semi-closed primaries. If you are running for the Democratic or Republican nomination in the vast majority of states in America, there's literally no incentive to be appealing to independents or Republicans or building a broad-based coalition. So in other words, the candidates who get on the ballot are designed to appeal to the activist base. Meanwhile, you have the exhausted majority out there often choosing between the lesser of two evils in the general election. And the third one is media. I think that there are a couple problems here. One, obviously, is that we have the polarized media. People are living in their own echo chambers, and the easiest way to get attention or get retweets or clicks is by hating the other side and not actually doing anything yourself. And so there are some solutions we should be looking at there. One is reinstating some form of a modern fairness doctrine that would apply to broadcast outlets and provide a bit more balanced reporting. There's a whole issue around funding in-depth journalism. Right now, it's like closest. One way of putting it is reporters have an incentive to put out shoddy, superficial journalism as opposed to in-depth, issues-based reporting. And I think there needs to be a business model and funding around that. Local media, we have these media deserts right now, so people are just not getting information. And then I also think another key solution here is with social media, which is like pouring gasoline on this fire. Um, Algorithms. I do think that we need to regulate social media algorithms, because this is like smoking cigarettes, addictive nature that social media companies are preying upon and profiting on. And I think that if we make these algorithms less predatory, we'll have a more, when you tune into social media, you'll get a fuller picture of what's going on.
If I lean left and I watch CNN, or if I lean right and I watch Fox, a lot of what they do is try to outrage me based on their reporting. And I just realized, why would I want to tune in to a network that is trying to outrage me, even though I might agree with their point of view? And that's why I had to remove myself from watching either of those channels, because they are in the business of working up their base.
Like you said, one of the best things you could do sometimes actually to be better informed is to not watch cable news all the time, because that really does sometimes give you a warped perspective of what's going on. At the same time, I do think finding thoughtful journalists as well as commentators who can who you can follow and read. I think the key here is having a diverse media diet. View your media consumption like you do having a meal or having a diet. You wouldn't want to have all sugar all the time, or want all carbs all the time.
Let's get back to electing younger people. How do you feel it strengthens the country by having younger representation at the local, state, and federal levels?
Hugely important, because we have a bias towards the future and issues that we're going to inherit in the future. And that's why it's no surprise that the environment and climate change is a generational issue. You see a majority of young Republicans who want to take action on it, and that translates into younger Republican members of Congress and state elected officials. So, having a bias towards the future is really important. The second thing is having a fresh approach to politics. I think that younger people, as they get involved, aren't necessarily seeing this as something that they want to do for 40 years. They are interested in having an impact, and by nature of getting elected at a young age, there's certainly a healthy impatience there, and maybe even a healthy disregard for the status quo. Just because something's been done one way for a while doesn't mean that a younger elected is going to follow suit. And I think the final thing is having fresh legs is certainly very helpful. Not having as much baggage about what's happened in the past, but also a willingness to use technology to enhance transparency around what's going on. So I know a number of young legislators who use online blogs, use TikTok, use social media to be able to just share what's going on in a pretty impartial, nonpartisan way. Like, this is the bill that's just come up. Here's what I'm thinking about it. Here's what I'm being told by my party. I think being able to peel the curtain back and share the behind the scenes of what it's really like to be a legislator through all of these new means of communication is really helpful. During our campaign, we used TikTok really effectively, and we were quite impressed with the kind of response we got to do live town halls when we're on the campaign trail, stream things. When I'm in between campaign events, go live on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and have live exchanges with voters. I think that kind of campaigning is something that people are yearning for, and I see more younger candidates willing to do that. Not exclusively. I do know some older candidates as well that do social media really well and use it for good as opposed to bad. But disproportionately, I would say younger candidates are good at using it in that way.
For our country, we're really getting close to 250 years. And I'm thinking, like, how are we going to make this happen for the next 250 years and even generations beyond that? So I want to ask you, when these young leaders are thinking about the future, what does that mean to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely a big question. But I think, well, let's start with some of the polling data we're seeing right now. So if you poll Generation Z right now, one of the most common feelings that comes up is the sense of tragedy. Like we've had all of these mass shootings, we have climate change looming, both presently as well as in the future. And we've grown up, or I shouldn't say we, because I'm a millennial, but younger people, both millennials and Gen Z, have come of age in a time of systemic government failure. And so a lot of major institutions, whether it's government, media, financial, have all failed in our lifetimes. And meanwhile, we've had these endless wars going on abroad, and many members of our generation going to serve and coming back with PTSD or other forms of long-term injuries. So all of this is happening, and I think that that's why we see such an interest among young people for system change. But I think the future is very much in question, and certainly requires a lot of young people to introduce a new mentality, a new set of systems, and sort of a civic architecture in order for us to feel more hopeful. And so I often talk about the civic idealism gap, where young people care about the issues, but they're skeptical about our existing institutions to solve them, and we got to close that gap.
So I want to ask you, what in 2022 you ran for U.S. Senate in Wisconsin. What did you learn about our political system from that experience?
Well, I'll point to two things. One is that the so-called exhausted majority, which are most people who are not hyper-partisan activists, who are just going about their normal days, want a more rational system, and leaders who can help bring us together, that exhausted majority is real. And I think that the populist movement for a more effective governance is also real, which our campaign tapped into as well. So I saw a lot of hopefulness being on the campaign trail, interacting with real people across party lines. And we ran the kind of campaign where we did attract this sort of unlikely coalition of people from the left to the right. And I thought the core issue that attracted everyone was the idea of rebuilding trust in our government. Whether you're from left, right, center, a lot of people just don't trust what's going on right now, and for good reason. And so talking about changing the system was very attractive. The second thing I'll just point to in terms of a key learning is that media is a democracy reform issue. When you have these media deserts and one or two people with all the power to decide media coverage, that's just not a healthy democracy. And, for example, we had a situation in our race where there was just, if you're being realistic, like one statewide print reporter that was covering this race, and that's not a good thing. And we saw a number of unsavory practices and poor journalism practices without any accountability.
Well, I have one more quick question for you, and I think you'll have an interesting answer. We know that we're not perfect in 2023. At least I know we're not perfect. I think we're not perfect right now. And And so my question is, what are the people of 2073, so 2.5 generations from now, going to look back at our current behaviors and just shake their heads at in disbelief?
So I would say three things come to mind that would be interesting at that time. One is whether we did something about AI to regulate it in a smart way. Already, we've been roughly 15 years behind on regulating social media, and the social media companies are putting their hands up saying, we want you to regulate us in a smart way. Same thing for AI. I think people would shake their heads and say, if we didn't do the smart things now, what were we doing? I think another one is climate change, because at that point we will have really seen potentially the effects of it. Like, what did we do right now when it was cheaper and more solvable? And then the third one will be whether or not democracy is still a leading form of governance in the world, or has another form of governance taken control of the kind of the world stage. And I think what's interesting is each of those three issues are at a key inflection point right now. And that's why it's so important for people to be tuned in, to be paying attention, to be finding concrete ways to get involved and take action. And this is, you know, um, no ordinary time that we're living in.
That's your mic drop moment. Stephen, thank you for your time and thank you for being a genius.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Don. It was a real pleasure.